Welcome back to another story on Infidelity Tales Lab. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. The Golden Years. James Escobar stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his corner office on the 42nd floor, watching the Manhattan skyline glitter in the late afternoon sun. At 38, he commanded one of the most successful investment portfolios on Wall Street, managing over $2 billion for Ross Capital Management. His track record was flawless, 15 years without a single losing quarter. Mr. Escobar, his assistant, Joyce Maxwell, appeared at the doorway. The quarterly reports are ready for your review. James turned from the window, his sharp gray eyes scanning the documents. The numbers told the same story they had for years: exponential growth, satisfied clients, and profits that made Ernest Ross one of the wealthiest men in New York. Under James's management, the firm had grown from a modest $50 million operation to a financial powerhouse. Joyce, schedule the client presentations for next week. Make sure Ernest and John are both available. James had learned early in his career that transparency bred trust, and trust bred loyalty. Every quarter, he personally presented results to their top-tier clients, explaining not just what happened, but why. The irony wasn't lost on him that he'd met his wife, Angelica, at one of these very presentations 7 years ago. She'd been fresh out of Harvard Business School, working as an analyst for a pension fund. Her questions were sharp, her insights astute, and her smile had completely derailed his usually flawless presentation. They'd married 2 years later, and Ernest Ross had gained not just a daughter-in-law, but the most talented portfolio manager on the East Coast. "James, you in there?" The gruff voice of Ernest Ross echoed from the outer office. At 65, Ernest was a bear of a man with silver hair and a permanent scowl. He'd built Ross Capital from nothing, starting as a small-time broker in Brooklyn before moving to Manhattan in the 80s. "Always working, Dad," James replied, using the term Ernest had insisted upon since the wedding. It had never felt natural. Ernest's weathered face appeared in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "Good. The Ross family doesn't raise quitters." He stepped into the office, closing the door behind him, an unusual gesture that immediately put James on alert. "Is everything all right?" "The third quarter numbers are exceptional. We're tracking for our best year yet." "That's exactly what I wanted to discuss." Ernest settled into the leather chair across from James's desk. 15 years is a hell of a run, son. You've made a lot of people very wealthy." Something in Ernest's tone made James's instincts prickle. In 15 years of working together, Ernest had never been one for small talk or sentiment. "I appreciate that, but I hope you're not thinking about retirement. We're just hitting our stride." Ernest's laugh was dry, humorless. "Oh, I'm not going anywhere. But I've been thinking about succession planning. John's finally ready to step up." John Ross was Ernest's son from his first marriage, a 32-year-old Harvard MBA who'd spent the last 5 years bouncing between different departments at Ross Capital. He was competent enough, but lacked the instinctive understanding of markets that separated good managers from great ones. "John's talented," James said carefully. "What role were you thinking?" "Your role." The words hung in the air like a physical presence. James felt his world tilt slightly, but his expression remained neutral, a skill learned from years of high-stakes negotiations. "I'm sorry. John will be taking over as Chief Investment Officer. It's time for fresh blood, new perspectives. The financial world is changing, and we need someone who understands the younger generation of investors." James's mind raced through the implications. 15 years of building relationships, developing strategies, nurturing client trust, all to be handed over to someone who'd never managed anything larger than a $10 million test portfolio. "Ernest, with respect, our clients trust me. They've invested based on my track record. A transition like this could spook them. They trust the Ross name," Ernest corrected, his voice hardening. "You've done well, James, but let's not forget who gave you this opportunity. John is family. Blood is thicker than water." The phrase hit James like a slap. Despite 7 years of marriage to Angelica, despite the successful partnership, despite treating Ernest like a father, he was still an outsider. "What exactly are you proposing?" "I'm not proposing anything. I'm telling you." John takes over Monday morning. You'll stay on for 2 weeks to facilitate the transition, then we'll find you something else. Maybe a smaller portfolio to start. James felt a cold fury building in his chest, but his voice remained steady. And Angelica? Does she know about this? She'll understand. Family comes first in the Ross household. James stood slowly, his 6-foot frame towering over the seated Ernest. I see. And my clients? The pension funds, the endowments, the private investors who specifically requested to work with me. They're Ross Capital clients, not James Escobar clients. Don't get too big for your britches, son. The dismissive tone was the final insult. James had sacrificed everything for this company. 60-hour weeks, missed family dinners, postponed vacations with Angelica. He'd turned down lucrative offers from competitors because he believed in loyalty, in building something lasting. I'll need to review my contract, James said quietly. Ernest's smile was predatory. Already taken care of. Legal says the succession clause gives me full discretion over portfolio assignments. Your non-compete is ironclad. 2 years. No financial services work in New York. It was then that James realized this wasn't a spontaneous decision. This was a calculated move, planned and executed with the precision of a hostile takeover. Ernest had been planning this for months, maybe years. I understand, James said finally. Good. I knew you'd be reasonable. Ernest stood, straightening his jacket. Family dinner Sunday night. Angelica's making that lasagna you like. We'll celebrate John's promotion then. As Ernest left the office, James remained standing at his desk, staring at the quarterly reports that would be his last. But instead of devastation, he felt something else entirely. A cold, calculating anger that reminded him exactly why he'd been so successful for so long. Ernest Ross had just made the biggest mistake of his life. Chapter 2, The Announcement. Sunday dinner at the Ross family estate in the Hamptons had always been a command performance. The sprawling Tudor mansion sat on 15 acres overlooking the Atlantic, a monument to old money and older grudges. James arrived with Angelica in their Tesla, the electric hum a stark contrast to the rumbling engines of the vintage Bentleys and Mercedes that filled the circular driveway. You've been quiet all weekend, Angelica observed as they walked up the stone steps. At 31, she had inherited her father's sharp business mind, but tempered it with a warmth that had been conspicuously absent from the Ross DNA for generations. Everything okay at work? James squeezed her hand. Just tired. Big week ahead. The lie felt necessary. Angelica's relationship with her father was complicated, equal parts love and exasperation. Ernest had never quite forgiven her for marrying outside the established social circle, despite James's obvious success. Adding family drama to that mix seemed cruel. James, there's my golden boy. John Ross's voice boomed across the marble foyer. He was already 3 drinks into what would undoubtedly be a long evening, his Harvard class ring catching the light as he gestured expansively. Dad told me the news. Congratulations on the promotion. John. James accepted the younger man's handshake, noting the slight tremor that spoke to either nerves or alcohol. Congratulations to you as well. The dining room was a study in understated wealth. A mahogany table that seated 12, crystal that had been in the Ross family for 3 generations, and oil paintings of ancestors who'd made their fortunes in less regulated times. Ernest presided at the head of the table like a feudal lord, while his current wife, Maxine, played the perfect hostess. Maxine Ross was wife number 3, a former model turned society maven who'd married Ernest 5 years earlier. At 45, she was closer in age to her stepchildren than to her husband, a fact that created its own undercurrents of tension. She was beautiful, calculating, and utterly devoted to maintaining her position in New York society. So, Maxine began as the staff served the first course. Ernest tells me we're having some exciting changes at the office. Dad's finally giving me a real shot, John said, his words slightly slurred. Time to show what the next generation can do. Angelica looked between her father and husband, sensing undercurrents she couldn't quite identify. What kind of changes? Ernest cleared his throat. John will be taking over as chief investment officer, effective immediately. James has done wonderful work, but it's time for fresh perspectives. The silence that followed was deafening. Angelica's fork stopped halfway to her mouth, her dark eyes widening as the implications sank in. You're replacing James? Her voice was carefully controlled, but James could see the storm building behind her composed facade. I'm promoting family, Ernest corrected. James will transition to a new role. There are plenty of opportunities at Ross Capital. What new role? Angelica's question was directed at her father, but her eyes were on James. We're still working out the details, James replied smoothly. He'd spent the weekend deciding how to handle this moment, and he'd concluded that patience was his best weapon. Let Ernest reveal his true nature without prompting. I don't understand, Angelica continued. James has generated more profit for this company than anyone in its history. Our clients specifically request him. His reputation is exactly the problem, Ernest interrupted, his mask slipping slightly. James Escobar has become the face of Ross Capital. That's not how family businesses work. The Ross name comes first. John, either oblivious to the tension or enjoying it, raised his glass. To new beginnings. Are you out of your mind? Angelica's composure finally cracked. James has made you hundreds of millions of dollars. He's never had a losing quarter. He's not family. Ernest's voice was ice cold. I built this company for my children, not for some outsider who got lucky with a few good trades. The insult hung in the air like poison gas. James felt Angelica's hand find his under the table, her grip tight with suppressed fury. That's enough, she said quietly. We're leaving. Sit down, Angelica. Ernest's command carried the weight of 31 years of paternal authority. This is business, not personal. Business. Angelica stood, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor. You're destroying a man's career out of petty jealousy and calling it business? I'm protecting my family's legacy, Ernest shot back. Something you'd understand if you hadn't been so blinded by pretty words and false promises. James felt something snap inside him. Not anger, but clarity. For 7 years, he'd tried to earn Ernest's respect, to prove himself worthy of the Ross name. But respect couldn't be earned from someone incapable of giving it. Angelica, James said quietly, it's all right. She turned to him, her eyes blazing. It's not all right. This is insane. Your husband understands the situation, Ernest said smugly. Perhaps you should take lessons from him in accepting reality. That was the moment James decided Ernest Ross needed to learn what reality actually looked like. You're right, James said, standing slowly. I do understand the situation. Better than you might think. Ernest's smug expression flickered slightly. Good. Then we can move forward without unnecessary drama. Oh, there won't be any drama, James agreed. Just consequences. Meaning, James smiled. A cold, predatory expression that made Maxine shiver and John reach for his wine glass. Meaning you've just made the most expensive mistake in Ross Capital's history. But you'll figure that out soon enough. Are you threatening me? I'm stating a fact. You want to play family politics with a $2 billion portfolio? You want to put your alcoholic son in charge of institutional investments? Go ahead. But when it all comes crashing down, remember that you chose this. Ernest's face turned purple. You signed a non-compete. You can't work in this industry for 2 years. I'm aware of the terms, James replied calmly. Just like I'm aware of the retention clauses in our major client contracts, the SEC regulations regarding portfolio manager changes, and the very specific fiduciary duties that come with managing other people's money. But I'm sure John learned all about that at Harvard. John's face had gone ashen. What retention clauses? James's smile widened. The ones that allow clients to withdraw their investments within 30 days of any management changes they don't approve of. But don't worry. I'm sure they'll all be thrilled to trust their retirement funds to someone whose biggest success was managing his trust fund. You son of a bitch, Ernest growled. You're trying to sabotage my company. I don't need to sabotage anything, James replied. You've done that yourself. I'm just not going to clean up the mess this time. He turned to Angelica, offering her his arm. Ready to go home? She nodded, still stunned by the rapid escalation of events. As they reached the dining room door, Ernest called out, This isn't over, James. I'll destroy you for this. James paused, looking back at the older man. Ernest, you just destroyed yourself. You're just too arrogant to see it yet. The drive home was silent until they reached the city. Then Angelica finally spoke. What retention clauses? James glanced at her, his expression unreadable. The ones I convinced our major clients to add to their contracts 3 years ago, just in case something like this ever happened. You've been planning for this? I've been planning for every contingency, James corrected. That's what good portfolio managers do. Angelica stared at him as if seeing him for the first time. What are you going to do? James's smile returned. Not cold this time, but genuinely warm. I'm going to give your father exactly what he asked for. A Ross family business. And then I'm going to show him what happens when you mistake loyalty for weakness. Chapter 3. The Confrontation. Monday morning arrived gray and drizzling, the kind of New York weather that matched the mood in the Ross Capital offices. James arrived at his usual time, 6:30 a.m., to find John Ross already in the main conference room, surrounded by legal documents and looking like a man facing execution. Morning, John, James said pleasantly, setting his coffee on the table. Ready for your first day as CIO? John looked up with bloodshot eyes. James, look, about yesterday, maybe we got off on the wrong foot. Did we? James settled into his chair with the casual confidence of a man who held all the cards. I thought your father made his position quite clear. Yeah, well, Dad gets emotional sometimes. Maybe we can work something out. A partnership, maybe? Co-sell us. James studied the younger man with clinical interest. John Ross was everything James wasn't. Privileged, entitled, and utterly unprepared for the reality of high-stakes financial management. Where James had clawed his way up from a middle-class background in Queens, working 3 jobs to pay for college and learning every aspect of the business from the ground up, John had coasted on his name and his father's connections. That's generous, John, but your father was very specific. Fresh blood, new perspectives. The next generation of leadership. Christ, James, half our clients don't even know who I am. The Pemberton Pension Fund, the university endowments, the sovereign wealth funds, they all specifically contracted for your management. Which brings us to an interesting legal question, James replied, pulling out a thick folder. Tell me, what do you know about fiduciary responsibility? John's face went pale. What do you mean? I mean that as of this morning, you're legally responsible for $2 billion in client assets. Every decision you make, every trade you execute, every recommendation you provide, it all has to meet the highest standard of professional care. One mistake, one decision that can't be justified as being in the client's best interest, and you're personally liable. Personally liable for what? Everything. Your trust fund, your apartment, your car, your future earnings. When you manage other people's money, John, you put everything you own on the line. Joyce Maxwell appeared in the doorway, her expression grim. Mr. Escobar? The Pemberton Fund is on line 1. They want to discuss the management transition. James checked his watch. Right on schedule. John, why don't you take that call? As the new CIO, they'll want to hear directly from you. Wait, I need to prepare. There's no time to prepare. Mr. Pemberton is a $100 billion pension fund. They don't wait. James pushed the phone toward John. Line 1. With trembling fingers, John pressed the speakerphone button. This is John Ross. The voice that emerged was crisp, authoritative, and distinctly unimpressed. Mr. Ross, this is Robert Kramer, Chief Investment Officer for the Pemberton Fund. We need to discuss the sudden change in portfolio management. Of course, Mr. Kramer. I'm excited to continue the excellent work that. Mr. Ross, our contract specifically names James Escobar as the designated portfolio manager. Any changes require our written approval, which we have not provided. John looked desperately at James, who merely smiled and sipped his coffee. I understand your concern, John stammered, but I assure you that Ross Capital will continue to provide the same level of... Mr. Ross, do you have Mr. Escobar's track record? What do you mean? 15 years of consecutive profitable quarters. Average annual returns of 18% above market benchmarks. 0 compliance violations. 0 client complaints. Do you have equivalent experience? The silence stretched uncomfortably before John finally answered. Not exactly the same experience, but then we're exercising our right to withdraw our assets immediately. Please have the transfer paperwork ready by close of business. The line went dead. John stared at the phone as if it had betrayed him personally. That's $400 million, James observed casually. Don't worry, though. I'm sure the others will be more understanding. As if summoned by his words, Joyce appeared again. The Harvard Endowment on line 2. Columbia University on line 3. The Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund is holding on line 4. John's face had gone from pale to green. This is a setup. You orchestrated this. I orchestrated nothing, James replied truthfully. I simply prepared for the inevitable. These clients invested with me personally, not with Ross Capital. When you remove me from the equation, they remove their money from the equation. Basic cause and effect. The office door burst open, and Ernest Ross stormed in like an aging hurricane. His usually immaculate appearance was disheveled, his tie askew, his silver hair uncombed, his face flushed with fury. What the hell is going on? He demanded. I've got 3 calls from major clients threatening to pull their assets. Good morning, Ernest, James said pleasantly. John and I were just discussing the transition. Don't play games with me, you arrogant little prick. You're sabotaging my company. Your company, James repeated slowly. Interesting choice of words. Because according to the quarterly reports I filed on Friday, Ross Capital Management currently has $2.1 billion under management. Of that, approximately $1.6 billion is tied to contracts that specifically name me as the portfolio manager. Ernest's bluster faltered slightly. Those contracts can be modified, only with client approval, which, as John just discovered, isn't exactly forthcoming. The phone rang again. Joyce's voice came through the intercom. Mr. Ross? The teacher's retirement fund. They are not happy. Ernest sank into a chair, the reality of the situation finally penetrating his arrogance. You can't do this. The non-compete prevents me from working for a competitor or starting my own firm. James finished. It doesn't prevent clients from exercising their contractual rights. I'm not soliciting anyone, Ernest. I'm not making recommendations. I'm simply not preventing the natural consequences of your decision. You smug bastard, Ernest snarled. You think you're untouchable? James leaned forward, his gray eyes cold as winter steel. I think I'm a man who spent 15 years building something magnificent, only to watch you try to destroy it out of petty jealousy. I think I'm someone who earned every dollar of success through hard work and intelligence, while you've spent your life believing that accident of birth makes you superior to everyone else. I made you. I gave you everything. You gave me an opportunity, James corrected. I made everything else myself. And now you're about to lose it all because you couldn't stand seeing an outsider succeed in your little kingdom. Ernest's phone buzzed. He glanced at it and winced. The board wants an emergency meeting. I'm sure they do. Losing 70% of your assets under management in a single morning tends to get people's attention. This isn't over. James stood, straightening his jacket. Actually, Ernest it is. You want a Ross family business? Congratulations. You got one. Of course, it's going to be a much smaller business. But blood is thicker than water, right? Where are you going? James paused at the door. I'm going to clean out my office. I believe that was your original request. Wait. Ernest's desperation was palpable. We can work something out. A partnership. You and John together. Really? Because yesterday you made it very clear that I wasn't family. That I was just an outsider who got lucky with a few good trades. Are you saying you were wrong? Ernest's face twisted with the effort of swallowing his pride. Maybe I was hasty. No, James said quietly. You were honest. For the first time in 7 years, you told me exactly what you thought of me. And now I'm returning the favor. He turned to John, who was still staring at the phone as if it might explode. Good luck, John. You're going to need it. James, please, John pleaded. I can't do this. Then you shouldn't have agreed to replace me. As James walked toward his office, he could hear Ernest's voice rising behind him, the sound of a man watching his empire crumble in real time. By the time James finished packing his personal items, the office was in chaos. phones ringing constantly, junior analysts running between offices with printouts, and the sound of Ernest Ross screaming at anyone within earshot. James paused at Joyce's desk on his way out. "Joyce, it's been a pleasure working with you." She looked up from her computer, where she was tracking the exodus of clients in real time. "Mr. Escobar, for what it's worth, I think they're making a terrible mistake." "No," James replied with a smile that was both sad and satisfied. "They're getting exactly what they deserve." As he walked out of Ross Capital Management for the last time, James's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "We need to talk. Robert Kramer, Pemberton Fund." James deleted the message without reading it twice. The non-compete would prevent him from taking any new positions for 2 years, but there were other ways to ensure justice was served. Ernest Ross had taught him that loyalty was a weakness, that family meant everything, and that blood was thicker than water. It was time to show Ernest just how wrong he'd been about all three. Chapter 4. The Foundation. 2 weeks after James's departure from Ross Capital, the financial press was having a field day. Exodus at Ross Capital. Management shakeup triggers client flight, read the headline in the Wall Street Journal. Ross Capital hemorrhaging assets after personnel changes, announced Financial Times. Bloomberg was even less diplomatic. Ross Capital in free fall as star manager exits. James read the articles from his home office in their Upper East Side apartment, a cup of coffee growing cold beside his laptop. The numbers were devastating. Ross Capital had lost $1.8 billion in assets under management in just 2 weeks. John Ross had lasted exactly 6 days as chief investment officer before suffering what his publicist described as exhaustion. Ernest had been forced to take personal control of the remaining portfolios, but his rusty skills and increasingly erratic behavior were driving away the few clients who hadn't already fled. "You're actually enjoying this," Angelica observed from the doorway. She was dressed for work in a sharp navy suit, her dark hair pulled back in a professional chignon. Since the disaster at her father's company, she'd thrown herself into her job at Peterson & Associates, one of Manhattan's premier mergers and acquisitions firms. "I'm observing the natural consequences of poor decision-making," James replied mildly. "There's a difference." "Is there?" She settled into the chair across from his desk, studying his face with the intensity she usually reserved for contract negotiations. "You orchestrated this entire collapse. I did nothing illegal, unethical, or even particularly clever. I simply prepared for contingencies and allowed events to unfold naturally." "That's not what I mean, and you know it." Angelica leaned forward, her expression serious. "James, I've known you for 7 years. I've seen you handle crises, market crashes, difficult clients, regulatory investigations. You're always calm, always in control, always 3 steps ahead of everyone else. This wasn't just preparation. This was warfare." James saved his document and closed the laptop, giving her his full attention. "Would you prefer I had rolled over and accepted your father's decision? Let him destroy my career and reputation while pretending it was for the good of the family? I would prefer my husband not orchestrate the destruction of my father's company out of revenge." "Your father destroyed his own company out of arrogance," James corrected. "I just didn't prevent it." They stared at each other across the desk, 7 years of marriage and partnership suddenly feeling fragile. Angelica had been caught in the middle from the beginning, loving both her husband and her father, understanding both perspectives but unable to reconcile them. "Tell me something," James said quietly. "When your father announced he was replacing me with John, what was your first thought?" "Honest answer." Angelica was quiet for a long moment. "That he was making a terrible mistake." "And your second thought?" "That you wouldn't let him get away with it." James nodded slowly. "Then you knew me better than your father did." Ernest Ross spent 7 years thinking I was a grateful son-in-law who would accept whatever scraps he threw my way. He never bothered to learn who I actually am. "And who are you exactly?" The question hung between them like a challenge. James stood and walked to the window, looking out at Central Park where early autumn was painting the leaves in shades of gold and crimson. "I'm the son of Maria and Carlos Escobar," he said finally. "My father worked 3 jobs to support our family: security guard at night, construction during the day, and weekend maintenance at an office building in Queens. My mother cleaned houses for wealthy families in Manhattan, taking the subway at 5 in the morning so she could have their breakfast ready when they woke up. Angelica knew these basic facts about his background, but she'd never heard him talk about his childhood with such raw honesty. When I was 12, James continued, my father got injured on a construction site, fell from scaffolding, and broke his back. The contractor fought the workers' compensation claim, said it was Dad's fault for not following safety protocols. The medical bills destroyed us. We lost our house, had to move in with my aunt in a one-bedroom apartment in Queens. James, I'm not finished. His voice was quiet but firm. My mother took on extra houses to pay for Dad's physical therapy. I got a job delivering newspapers before school, working in a grocery store after school, anything to help. And you know what I learned during those years? Angelica waited. I learned that fairness is a luxury only wealthy people can afford. I learned that hard work and loyalty mean nothing if you don't have power to back them up. And I learned that when powerful people decide to destroy you, your only choice is to destroy them first. He turned from the window, his gray eyes intense. Your father thought he could discard me like a used tissue because I didn't have the right last name. He thought my gratitude would keep me compliant, that my love for you would make me accept his decision quietly. He was wrong about everything. So this is about more than just the job. This is about respect, James said simply. I spent 15 years earning earnest respect through my work, my results, my dedication. But respect can't be earned from someone who fundamentally believes you're beneath them. Your father never saw me as an equal, never saw me as family. I was just a useful tool who had outlived his purpose. Angelica was quiet for a long moment, processing his words. What happens now? Now your father learns what it means to truly lose everything. Not just money. Money can be replaced. But reputation, trust, credibility? Those take decades to build and seconds to destroy. And us. James moved to her chair, kneeling beside it, and taking her hands. Us is not negotiable. You're my wife, my partner, my best friend. Whatever happens with your father doesn't change that. Even if I don't agree with your methods. Even then. He squeezed her hands gently. But I need you to understand something, Angelica. I'm not the same man who walked into your father's office 7 years ago, grateful for any opportunity. That man was willing to endure insults and condescension because he thought it was the price of success. This man knows better. What are you planning? James smiled, and for the first time in weeks, it reached his eyes. I'm planning to show your father that some mistakes have permanent consequences. Before Angelica could respond, James's phone rang. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize, but something about it seemed familiar. James Escobar. Mr. Escobar, this is Luther Zimmerman from the Securities and Exchange Commission. We need to schedule a meeting to discuss certain irregularities at Ross Capital Management. James felt a chill run down his spine, but his voice remained steady. What kind of irregularities? The kind that require federal investigation. How soon can you come in? James looked at Angelica, whose face had gone pale. I'll need to consult with my attorney first. Of course. But Mr. Escobar, don't take too long. We have questions about your role in the recent client exodus, and there are some people who think you may have engaged in market manipulation or breach of fiduciary duty. The line went dead. James stared at the phone, his mind racing through the implications. What was that about? Angelica asked. Your father just escalated this conflict to a whole new level, James replied grimly. He's trying to have me investigated for securities fraud. Can he do that? James's smile returned, but this time it was cold as winter moonlight. He could try. But Ernest Ross just made his second mistake. The first was underestimating me. The second was giving me a legitimate reason to destroy him completely. James, I need to make some calls, he said, already reaching for his laptop. This changes everything. As Angelica watched her husband transform from contemplative to predatory, she realized that the quiet, controlled man she'd married had always been capable of this level of focused ruthlessness. She'd just never seen him with a worthy opponent before. The real war was just beginning. Chapter 5. The Investigation. The offices of Whitman Cobb and Associates occupied 3 floors of a midtown Manhattan tower, and partner Douglas McCarty's corner office commanded a view of both the Hudson River and the organized chaos that was New York's legal district. At 58, McCarty was one of the city's most respected securities attorneys, a former federal prosecutor who'd made his reputation dismantling white-collar criminals before switching sides to defend them. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly," McCarty said, reviewing the documents James had provided. "Your former father-in-law terminated your employment, installed his unqualified son as your replacement, and when their clients exercised their contractual right to withdraw their assets, he reported you to the SEC for market manipulation?" "That's an accurate summary," James replied. He sat across from McCarty's desk with the relaxed posture of a man who'd prepared for this eventuality years in advance. "And you're telling me you took no action to encourage these client departures?" "I took no action whatsoever. I followed the terms of my non-compete agreement to the letter. I haven't contacted a single client, made any recommendations, or provided any advice regarding their investments." McCarty leaned back in his leather chair, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "James, I've been practicing securities law for 30 years. I've seen every dirty trick, every gray area maneuver, every creative interpretation of fiduciary duty. What you did was absolutely brilliant. I'm not sure I follow. You didn't need to contact the clients directly. You'd already structured their contracts to protect them, and yourself, from exactly this scenario. When Ernest Ross removed you as portfolio manager, he triggered automatic withdrawal clauses that you'd negotiated years earlier. The clients aren't fleeing because you told them to. They're fleeing because their contracts require them to. The retention clauses were standard risk management," James said carefully. "Many institutional investors prefer name manager provisions." "Bullshit," McCarty said cheerfully. "You were planning for this exact scenario. The question is, can the SEC prove it? Can they?" McCarty opened another file folder, this one containing communications between the SEC and Ross Capital's legal team. "Ernest Ross provided them with copies of your employment contract, client agreements, and trading records going back 5 years. He's alleging that you structured these arrangements specifically to damage Ross Capital if you were ever terminated. That would be difficult to prove, since the arrangements benefited both the clients and the firm." "Exactly. The retention clauses protected client interests by ensuring continuity of management. The withdrawal provisions gave them flexibility to respond to changes they didn't approve of. From a legal perspective, you were doing your job. From a practical perspective," McCarty's smile widened, "you were building the perfect revenge mechanism." James remained silent, his expression neutral. "The SEC is going to interview you next week," McCarty continued. "They're particularly interested in your communications with clients over the past month, any advance warning you might have given about management changes, and whether you violated your non-compete agreement." "I haven't violated anything." "I know, which is what makes this so beautiful. Ernest Ross is essentially asking the federal government to investigate his own incompetence." McCarty closed the files and fixed James with a direct stare. "But there's something else going on here, isn't there? This feels personal." "It is personal." "Care to elaborate?" James was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "Ernest Ross built his company on the premise that family loyalty trumps everything else. Competence, performance, ethics, none of that matters as much as blood relations. He spent 30 years surrounding himself with people who share that philosophy. And now he's discovering the limitations of that approach. He's discovering that the rest of the world doesn't share his values. Institutional investors don't care about family dynasties. They care about returns, risk management, and fiduciary responsibility. When Ernest removed me and installed John, he was telling his clients that family connections matter more than their financial security." McCarty nodded slowly. They didn't appreciate the message. They responded exactly as any rational investor would respond when a fund manager prioritizes nepotism over performance. "So what's your endgame here?" "The SEC investigation will likely be dropped within a month once they realize there's no evidence of wrongdoing. Ross Capital will eventually stabilize, probably at a much smaller size. Ernest learns his lesson, maybe brings you back, maybe doesn't. Where does this end? James's expression hardened. It ends when Ernest Ross understands that some people can't be discarded without consequences. It ends when he realizes that loyalty is a two-way street. It ends when he pays a price that actually matters. And what price would that be? Everything. McCarty studied his client with professional interest. In 30 years of practice, he'd represented politicians, CEOs, hedge fund managers, and tech billionaires. He'd seen ego, greed, and revenge in every conceivable form. But there was something different about James Escobar, a cold, calculating patience that suggested this confrontation was far from over. James, I need to ask you directly. Are you planning to do anything that might constitute securities fraud, market manipulation, or breach of fiduciary duty? No. Are you planning any actions that might be considered illegal or unethical? Define unethical. McCarty's eyebrows rose. That's not a reassuring answer. I'm not planning to break any laws, James clarified. But I am planning to ensure that Ernest Ross experiences the full consequences of his decisions. Some of those consequences might be uncomfortable. I strongly advise you to stay within legal boundaries. I intend to. The law is actually quite useful for what I have in mind. Before McCarty could respond, his assistant's voice came through the intercom. Mr. McCarty? There's a Robert Kramer here to see Mr. Escobar. Says it's urgent. James and McCarty exchanged glances. Kramer was the CIO of the Pemberton Fund, one of the first clients to withdraw from Ross Capital. Send him in, McCarty said. Robert Kramer was a compact man in his 60s with silver hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to managing vast sums of money. He entered the office with the efficient stride of a man who valued time above all else. Mr. Escobar, he said without preamble, we need to discuss your future. Mr. Kramer, I appreciate the interest, but my non-compete agreement prevents you from working for a competitor or starting your own firm for 2 years. I'm aware of the terms. Kramer settled into the chair beside James. I'm not here to offer you a job. Then why are you here? To propose a partnership. Pemberton Fund manages pension assets for over 2 million teachers, firefighters, police officers, and public employees. We need sophisticated investment management, but we also need managers who understand fiduciary responsibility. Managers who put client interests first. James remained silent, waiting for the proposition. We're prepared to make you a consulting partner, Kramer continued. You wouldn't be managing assets directly, so the non-compete wouldn't apply. You'd be advising on strategy, risk management, and due diligence. In exchange, we pay you a base fee plus a percentage of returns above benchmark. McCarty leaned forward. What kind of base fee? $5 million annually, plus 20% of excess returns. For reference, excess returns on our current portfolio run about $40 million per year. The offer was staggering, potentially $15 million annually for part-time consulting work. It was also a clear message to the financial community that institutional investors valued James's expertise far more than Ernest Ross had realized. That's generous, James said carefully, but I need to understand the scope of the work. Strategy consulting, portfolio analysis, due diligence on investment managers. Kramer's smile was slight but meaningful. We might also need advice on withdrawing assets from underperforming funds. The implication was clear. Pemberton Fund was preparing to systematically withdraw investments from any firm that demonstrated poor management or questionable ethics. Given their size and influence, other institutional investors would likely follow their lead. I'll need to review this with my attorney, James said. Of course. But Mr. Escobar, I want you to understand something. What happened at Ross Capital is being watched closely by everyone in our industry. The way Ernest Ross treated you, the priorities he demonstrated, the incompetence he revealed, it's made a lot of people very nervous about their own managers. Meaning there's about to be a significant consolidation in our industry. Institutional investors are going to become much more selective about who they trust with their assets. Firms that prioritize nepotism over competence, that treat talented managers poorly, that demonstrate questionable judgment, they're going to find themselves without clients very quickly. After Kramer left, McCarty and James sat in silence for several minutes. Well, McCarty said finally, that changes the dynamic considerably. How so? You've just become the most powerful unemployed person on Wall Street. If Pemberton Fund is offering you that kind of package, other institutional investors will follow. You'll have influence over hundreds of billions in assets. James nodded slowly. And Ernest Ross is about to discover that destroying my career was the worst business decision he's ever made. James, McCarty said seriously, you need to be very careful here. The line between legitimate business competition and personal vendetta can be thin. Don't cross it. I won't need to cross it, James replied. Ernest is going to destroy himself. I'm just going to make sure everyone has a front row seat. Chapter 6, The Unraveling. 3 months after James's departure from Ross Capital, the company's quarterly board meeting convened in the mahogany-paneled conference room that had once symbolized Ernest Ross's dominance over New York's financial elite. Now it felt more like a war room under siege. The board members, 5 of Manhattan's most prominent business leaders, sat around the polished table with expressions ranging from concern to barely concealed panic. Assets under management had plummeted from $2.1 billion to $400 million. The firm's reputation was in tatters. And Ernest Ross, at the head of the table, looked like a man who'd aged a decade in 3 months. Let's dispense with pleasantries, said Philip Byers, the board's chairman and managing partner of a major law firm. Ernest, your company is hemorrhaging money, clients, and credibility. We need to discuss immediate action. Ernest's bloodshot eyes swept the table, searching for allies he no longer had. The market's been volatile. We're experiencing temporary challenges. Temporary, interrupted Diane Hoover, CEO of a major insurance company. You've lost 80% of your client base. The SEC investigation may be closed, but the damage to your reputation is permanent. Our own due diligence team is recommending we withdraw our pension fund from your management. You're overreacting, Ernest insisted, but his voice lacked conviction. We're rebuilding with quality clients, focused management. Ernest, said Clark Walter, a real estate magnate who'd known Ernest for 20 years, you need to face reality. James Escobar was the foundation of this company's success. When you removed him, you removed the primary reason clients chose Ross Capital. John is perfectly capable. John is in rehab, Philip Byers stated flatly, for the second time in 3 months. Your son couldn't handle the pressure of managing a lemonade stand, much less institutional investments. The silence that followed was deafening. Ernest's face reddened, but for once, he seemed to have no response. We've received several inquiries, continued Byers, about the possibility of selling Ross Capital's remaining assets to larger management firms. Given the current situation, it might be the most responsible course of action. Sell. Ernest's voice cracked. This is my company, my life's work. Your life's work is currently worth about 10 cents on the dollar, Diane observed coldly, and it's declining daily. As if summoned by the mention of declining value, Joyce Maxwell appeared in the doorway. She'd remained at Ross Capital throughout the chaos, partly out of loyalty and partly because few companies were hiring assistants from a firm under federal investigation. Mr. Ross. Her voice was carefully neutral. There's a delegation here to see you. What kind of delegation? Representatives from the Teachers' Retirement Fund, the Police Pension Alliance, and the Municipal Workers Union. They're requesting an immediate meeting. Ernest exchanged glances with the board members. The 3 organizations represented the last significant institutional clients still with Ross Capital, accounting for nearly $200 million of the firm's remaining $400 million in assets. Send them in, Philip Byers said when Ernest seemed incapable of responding. The delegation that entered was led by Wendy McCullough, the formidable chief investment officer for the Teachers' Retirement Fund. A former Marine turned financial manager, she had a reputation for protecting her members' interests with ruthless efficiency. Gentlemen, she began without preamble, we're here to inform you that our 3 organizations will be withdrawing our assets from Ross Capital Management effective immediately. Ernest lurched to his feet. Wendy, you can't be serious. We've managed your assets for over a decade. Which is exactly why this decision is so painful, she interrupted. But we can no longer trust Ross Capital to prioritize our members' financial security over family politics. What are you talking about? Wendy opened a folder and placed several documents on the table. 3 months ago, you fired the most successful portfolio manager in your firm's history and replaced him with your unqualified son. That decision has cost our members approximately $40 million in lost returns. The market has been challenging for everyone. The market has been fine for competent managers, Wendy stated. Our consultants have analyzed the performance of firms using similar strategies to what James Escobar employed at Ross Capital. They're averaging 12% returns this quarter. You're averaging negative 3%. Clark Walter leaned forward to examine the documents. These are comparative performance analyses conducted by our independent consultants, confirmed Wendy. They clearly demonstrate that Ross Capital's underperformance correlates directly with Mr. Escobar's departure and your son's management decisions. Ernest's face was now purple with rage and humiliation. You're basing financial decisions on office gossip. We're basing financial decisions on mathematical analysis and fiduciary responsibility, Wendy corrected. Our members are teachers, firefighters, and public workers who depend on their pension funds for retirement security. We cannot allow personal vendettas to jeopardize their futures. Personal vendettas? Mr. Ross, everyone in our industry knows why you fired James Escobar. It wasn't performance-based. It wasn't strategic. It was family politics, pure and simple. You prioritized your son's career over your client's financial interests. Ernest opened his mouth to argue, but Wendy wasn't finished. Furthermore, we've received detailed analyses from Pemberton Fund's new consulting partner regarding Ross Capital's risk management practices. The report identifies several concerning trends that suggest fundamental problems with your current approach. What consulting partner? Asked Philip Byers. James Escobar, Wendy replied simply. He's been retained by Pemberton Fund to evaluate institutional investment managers. His analysis of Ross Capital's recent performance is unflattering. The revelation hit the room like a physical blow. Ernest staggered backward, gripping the edge of the table for support. That's impossible, he whispered. He has a non-compete agreement, which doesn't prevent him from providing consulting services to institutional investors, Wendy explained. Mr. Escobar has been very careful to remain within legal boundaries while demonstrating the consequences of poor management decisions. Clark Walter began laughing, a bitter, incredulous sound. Jesus Christ, Ernest. He's systematically destroying your company, and he's doing it completely legally. The withdrawal process will be completed within 30 days, Wendy announced. We're sorry it's come to this, but our fiduciary duty is clear. After the delegation left, the board members sat in stunned silence. The loss of the 3 pension funds would reduce Ross Capital's assets under management to approximately $200 million, barely enough to keep the lights on. We need to discuss immediate liquidation, Philip Byers said finally. No, Ernest said quietly. There has to be another way. Ernest, face reality. Your company is finished. James Escobar has turned the entire institutional investment community against you. Every client you lose makes the next departure easier. It's a death spiral. Then I'll rebuild. Start over. Prove him wrong. Diane Hoover shook her head sadly. With what? You have no credible portfolio managers, no institutional relationships, and a reputation that's toxic throughout the industry. Even if you could attract new capital, who would trust you to manage it? Ernest Ross sat down heavily, the weight of his situation finally breaking through his denial. For the first time in his adult life, he was facing complete and utter defeat. There is one option, Clark Walter said slowly. You could approach James directly. Apologize. Offer him partnership. Try to salvage something from this disaster. Never, Ernest snarled. I'll burn this company to the ground before I grovel to that arrogant prick. Then you'll get your wish, Philip replied. Because that's exactly what's happening. As the board members filed out of the conference room, Ernest remained seated at the table, staring at the documents Wendy McCullough had left behind. The performance analyses were damning, but what truly crushed his spirit was the realization that James Escobar had orchestrated this entire collapse without breaking a single law or regulation. He'd been outplayed by a man he considered inferior, outwitted by someone he dismissed as a grateful employee. And the most humiliating part was that James had never lied to him. He'd warned Ernest explicitly that removing him would have consequences. He'd predicted exactly what would happen. Ernest Ross had simply been too arrogant to listen. Chapter 7. The Final Gambit. 6 months after his departure from Ross Capital, James Escobar sat in his home office reviewing the latest quarterly reports from his consulting clients. The Pemberton Fund's portfolio had grown by $180 million under his strategic guidance. The Teachers' Retirement Fund had achieved record returns. The Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund had formally requested his advisory services for their North American investments. His consulting fees for the quarter exceeded $12 million. Across town, Ross Capital Management was preparing for bankruptcy proceedings. "You're actually going to enjoy this," Angelica observed from the doorway. She was holding a cup of coffee and the morning edition of the Financial Times, whose headline read, "Ross Capital Collapse, a case study in management failure." "I'm going to find it satisfying," James corrected, saving his document. "There's a difference." "Is there?" "Because you've been planning this endgame for months." James leaned back in his chair, studying his wife's expression. Their relationship had weathered the storm of his conflict with her father, but not without casualties. Angelica had been forced to choose between supporting her husband's methodical destruction of her father's company or maintaining family loyalty. She'd chosen James, but the cost had been significant. "Your father destroyed his own company," James said gently. "I just didn't prevent it by systematically turning every major institutional investor against him, by providing honest, professional analysis of his management decisions. When pension funds ask me to evaluate investment managers, I give them accurate information. If that information reflects poorly on Ross Capital, that's Ernest's fault, not mine." Angelica settled into the chair across from his desk. "The bankruptcy filing will be public next week." "I know. He'll lose everything. The company, the Hamptons house, most of his personal assets." "I know. James, he's my father." James reached across the desk and took her hand. "And he made a series of choices that led to this outcome. I didn't force him to fire me. I didn't force him to install John as CIO. I didn't force him to prioritize family politics over client interests. Every consequence he's facing is the direct result of his own decisions. But you could stop it. Even now, you could probably save Ross Capital if you wanted to." "Could I? And should I?" The question hung between them like a challenge. After 6 months of watching her father's empire crumble, Angelica was struggling with the morality of James's approach. What would that teach him? James continued, "That he can discard people without consequences? That loyalty is meaningless? That talent and dedication are less important than family connections? It would teach him mercy, forgiveness." "No," James said firmly. "It would teach him that other people will always clean up his mistakes. Ernest Ross has spent his entire life believing that his actions don't have permanent consequences. It's time he learned otherwise." Before Angelica could respond, James's phone rang. The caller ID showed a familiar number that made his blood run cold. Ernest Ross. James hadn't spoken to his former father-in-law since their confrontation 6 months earlier. He considered letting the call go to voicemail, but something made him answer. "Ernest, James." The voice on the other end was barely recognizable. Hoarse, defeated, stripped of the arrogance that had once defined Ernest Ross. "I need to see you." "I'm not sure that's a good idea. Please, one conversation, face to face." James looked at Angelica, who was watching him with intense curiosity. "Where?" "My office. This afternoon. Just you and me." The line went dead. James stared at the phone, his mind racing through possibilities. After 6 months of silence, Ernest Ross was ready to talk. The question was whether James was ready to listen. "He wants to meet," James told Angelica. "Are you going?" "I think I have to. This has gone on long enough." 2 hours later, James walked through the familiar lobby of the Ross Capitol building for the first time since his departure. The changes were immediately apparent. The bustling energy was gone, replaced by an atmosphere of quiet desperation. The receptionist he recognized was gone, replaced by a temp agency worker who barely looked up from her computer. The elevator ride to the executive floor felt like ascending to a mausoleum. Half the offices were empty, their former occupants having fled to competitors or been laid off in successive rounds of cost-cutting. The remaining staff moved through the halls like survivors of a natural disaster. Ernest's office door was open, and James could see his former father-in-law sitting behind his desk, staring out at the Manhattan skyline. At 65, Ernest looked 20 years older, his hair completely white, his face gaunt, his expensive suit hanging loosely on a frame that had lost considerable weight. "Hello, Ernest." Ernest turned slowly, his eyes focusing on James with visible effort. "Thank you for coming. You said you wanted to talk. Sit down, please." James remained standing. "I think I'll stay here." Ernest nodded as if he'd expected this response. "I suppose I deserve that. You deserve a lot of things." "James, I need you to understand something. When I fired you, when I brought John in to replace you, I thought I was protecting my family's legacy. I know what you thought. I was wrong." The admission seemed to cost Ernest tremendous effort. About everything. About John, about family loyalty, about what this company really needed. "I was wrong about you." James remained silent, waiting. "You were never just an employee," Ernest continued. "You were the heart of this company, the reason it succeeded, the reason our clients trusted us. And I threw that away because I was jealous of your talent, your success, the respect you earned. I built this company from nothing, James, but you made it great. And instead of being grateful, I resented you for it." Ernest stood slowly, moving to the window where James had once planned his days. "I lost everything," he said quietly. "The company, the clients, the reputation I spent 30 years building. My son is in rehab again. My wife is talking about divorce. The bankruptcy filing will be public next week. I know you know." Ernest turned to face James directly. "I know you orchestrated all of it. I did nothing illegal or unethical. No, you did something much more devastating. You did exactly what you said you would do. You gave me what I asked for, a Ross family business. And you let me discover what that was really worth." James felt no satisfaction in Ernest's admission, only a kind of weary completion. "What do you want from me, Ernest?" "I want to offer you the company." The words hit James like a physical blow. "What?" "Ross Capital Management. What's left of it. The name, the remaining assets, the infrastructure. I'm prepared to sign over controlling interest to you." "Why would you do that?" "Because it's the only way any of this means anything. If the company dies with me, then 30 years of work disappears. But if you take it over, if you rebuild it, maybe something survives." James stared at the older man, searching for the catch, the hidden manipulation. But Ernest's desperation seemed genuine. "And what would you get in return?" "The satisfaction of knowing I made one right decision before it was too late." "No," James said quietly. "What would you really get?" Ernest's facade cracked slightly. "A chance that my daughter might forgive me. A hope that my grandson might inherit something other than bankruptcy and shame." There it was, the real motivation. Even in defeat, Ernest Ross was trying to manipulate the situation to his advantage. "You're still trying to use family loyalty to get what you want," James observed. "Yes," Ernest admitted, "because it's the only thing I have left." James walked to the window, looking out at the city where he'd built his reputation and destroyed Ernest's. After 6 months of systematic revenge, he felt empty rather than triumphant. "I'll consider your offer," he said finally. "James, I'll consider it. But understand something, Ernest. If I take over Ross Capital, it won't be your company anymore. It won't be a family business. It'll be a meritocracy where talent matters more than bloodline, where loyalty is earned rather than demanded. Understand, do you? Because there won't be a place for John in my company. There won't be special treatment for family members. There won't be nepotism or preferential treatment based on last names." Ernest nodded slowly. "I understand. Then we'll talk again next week." after the bankruptcy filing is complete. As James walked toward the door, Ernest called out one last time. James? For what it's worth. I'm sorry. James paused without turning around. You're not sorry for what you did, Ernest. You're sorry it didn't work. The silence that followed was answer enough. Chapter 8. The Reckoning. The bankruptcy proceedings for Ross Capital Management were held in a sterile federal courthouse in Lower Manhattan, the kind of place where American dreams went to die officially. James arrived early, taking a seat in the gallery, where he could observe without being noticed. He wasn't a creditor or debtor, just a witness to the final chapter of Ernest Ross's empire. The courtroom slowly filled with lawyers, creditors, and financial journalists. Ernest sat at the defendant's table with his attorney, looking like a man attending his own funeral. His once commanding presence had been reduced to a shell of defeated arrogance. Judge Lee Jacobs, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s, called the proceedings to order with the efficient brutality that bankruptcy court demanded. We're here today to address the petition for Chapter 11 reorganization filed by Ross Capital Management, she announced. Mr. Ross, you may proceed. Ernest's attorney, a tired-looking man who clearly wished he were anywhere else, began the litany of financial failure. Assets worth $200 million against debts of $180 million. Operational losses of $15 million per quarter. No viable path to profitability without major restructuring. Your Honor, the attorney continued, my client requests court approval for the sale of Ross Capital's remaining assets to Escobar Capital Management, a newly formed investment firm. James felt every eye in the courtroom turned toward him. He'd filed the incorporation papers for Escobar Capital Management the previous week, along with the paperwork necessary to acquire Ross Capital's assets. The irony wasn't lost on anyone present. Mr. Escobar, Judge Jacobs said, please approach the bench. James walked forward, acutely aware that this moment would define the rest of his career. The judge reviewed his financial statements, corporate structure, and proposed acquisition terms with the methodical precision of someone who'd seen every possible variation of financial collapse. Your offer is for $12 million cash for all remaining assets, she noted. That's correct, Your Honor. Including the Ross Capital name and client relationships? Yes, Your Honor, though I intend to rebrand the firm as Escobar Capital Management. Mr. Ross, the judge turned to Ernest. Do you agree to these terms? Ernest struggled to his feet, his dignity hanging by threads. Yes, Your Honor. Very well. The sale is approved. And just like that, 30 years of Ernest Ross's life work legally became James Escobar's property. After the proceedings, James found Ernest waiting in the courthouse lobby. The older man looked lost, like a tourist in a foreign country where he didn't speak the language. It's done, Ernest said simply. It's done, James agreed. They stood in uncomfortable silence for several moments before Ernest spoke again. What happens now? Now you retire, James replied. You take your remaining personal assets, move to Florida or Arizona, and disappear from the financial world forever. And John needs to find his own path, preferably in an industry that doesn't require fiduciary responsibility. Ernest nodded slowly. And Angelica? Angelica is my wife. This doesn't change that. She hates me now. She's disappointed in you. There's a difference. Ernest looked around the courthouse lobby, perhaps realizing this would be his last conversation with James as anything approaching an equal. For what it's worth, he said, you won. Completely and totally. I underestimated you from the beginning. You didn't underestimate me, James corrected. You never bothered to see me at all. You saw what you wanted to see. A grateful employee who would accept whatever scraps you threw his way. And now you know better. Ernest extended his hand, a final gesture of respect or surrender. James considered leaving him hanging, but ultimately shook it briefly. Goodbye, Ernest. Goodbye, James. As Ernest walked away, his footsteps echoing in the marble lobby, James felt the strange emptiness that comes with completing a long-term project. 6 months of careful planning had culminated in this moment. Ernest Ross's complete and utter defeat. But victory, James discovered, felt different than he'd expected. Less triumphant, more exhausted. His phone buzzed with a text from Angelica. "How did it go?" "It's over," he replied. "Everything, everything." James left the courthouse and walked through Lower Manhattan, past the memorial sites, and toward the financial district where he'd built his reputation. In 3 days, he would take control of Ross Capital's remaining assets and begin the process of rebuilding. Several former clients had already expressed interest in returning once the Ross name was removed. But first, he had one more conversation to complete. He found Angelica waiting in their apartment, staring out at Central Park where autumn was giving way to winter. She turned when he entered, her expression unreadable. "Is it finished?" she asked. "The bankruptcy is complete. I now own what's left of your father's company. And how does that feel?" James considered the question seriously. "Empty. Necessary, but empty. Do you regret it?" "No. Your father needed to learn that actions have consequences. But I don't feel good about it." Angelica moved to the window, pressing her palm against the cold glass. "He called me this afternoon, and he wanted me to know that he understands now what you are, what he lost when he fired you. Too little, too late. Maybe. But James, I need you to understand something too." She turned to face him, her dark eyes serious. "What you did over the past 6 months, it was brilliant, ruthless, and completely justified. But it also showed me a side of you I'd never seen before." "What side?" "The side that's capable of destroying someone completely and feeling nothing about it." James felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. "Are you saying you're afraid of me?" "I'm saying I'm afraid of what you might become if you let that side take control. My father created an enemy when he fired you. I don't want to see you become the kind of person who creates enemies out of everyone who disappoints you. That's not who I am, isn't it?" "James, you spent 6 months systematically destroying my father's life. You isolated him, humiliated him, bankrupted him, and then bought his company for pennies on the dollar. You did it all legally, professionally, and without a moment's hesitation. He earned every bit of it." "Maybe he did. But what happens the next time someone crosses you? What happens when an employee disappoints you, or a client questions your judgment, or a competitor tries to steal your business? Do you destroy them too?" The question hung between them like an accusation. James realized that in his focus on defeating Ernest Ross, he'd never considered what victory might cost him personally. "I did what I had to do," he said finally. "I know, and I supported you because you were right. But James, don't let winning this war change you into someone I can't recognize." James pulled her into his arms, feeling the fragility of their relationship for the first time in their marriage. "I won't," he promised. "This was about justice, not revenge. Ernest Ross taught me that loyalty means nothing if you don't have the power to defend it. I'll never be that vulnerable again, but I won't become him either. Promise me." "I promise." But as they stood together in their apartment, watching the last light fade from the autumn sky, James wondered if some transformations were irreversible. He'd set out to teach Ernest Ross a lesson about respect and consequences. The question was whether he'd learned something about himself in the process, something that couldn't be unlearned. Chapter 9. New Foundations. 1 year later, Escobar Capital Management occupied the entire 42nd floor of a Manhattan tower, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a commanding view of the city where James had rebuilt his empire from the ashes of Ernest Ross's arrogance. The firm managed $3.2 billion in assets, employed 47 of the industry's top analysts and portfolio managers, and had achieved the remarkable feat of being oversubscribed, turning away potential clients because demand exceeded capacity. James stood in his corner office, reviewing the quarterly performance reports that would be delivered to clients the following week. Every number told the same story: exceptional returns, conservative risk management, and client satisfaction ratings that set industry standards. "Mr. Escobar," Joyce Maxwell's voice came through the intercom. She'd followed James from Ross Capital, along with most of the senior staff who'd recognized which side of the conflict held the future. "The Harvard Endowment is here for their quarterly review. Send them in." The delegation that entered represented $53 billion in assets and Harvard University's commitment to long-term financial stability. Dr. Patricia Haas, the endowment's chief investment officer, led a team of analysts and trustees who'd entrusted Escobar Capital with $800 million, their largest single investment outside of Harvard Management Company itself. James, Dr. Haas said warmly, settling into the conference table that dominated half his office. I have to say, these preliminary numbers are extraordinary. 22% returns year to date, added her deputy, Thomas Chun. That's nearly double our benchmark expectations. James distributed bound copies of the detailed performance analysis he'd prepared. The returns are gratifying, but I want to walk you through the risk parameters as well. Strong performance means nothing if it's achieved through excessive risk-taking. For the next hour, James presented a comprehensive analysis of every investment decision, market assumption, and risk calculation that had driven their portfolio success. It was the kind of transparency that had built his reputation. Clients didn't just see results, they understood exactly how those results were achieved. This is why we chose Escobar Capital, Dr. Haas said as the presentation concluded. Not just the performance, but the philosophy. You treat our assets like they belong to your own family. Because they do, James replied simply. Every dollar you invest represents a student's education, a professor's research, a breakthrough that might change the world. That responsibility drives every decision we make. After the Harvard delegation left, James returned to his desk to find a message from his assistant. Your 3 p.m. appointment is here. He'd blocked the time for a meeting, but hadn't specified the nature or attendee. Curious, he walked to the reception area to find a familiar figure waiting in one of the leather chairs. John Ross had aged considerably in the year since his father's bankruptcy. The boyish arrogance was gone, replaced by something approaching humility. He'd lost weight. His expensive clothes had been replaced by an off-the-rack suit, and his hands showed the slight tremor of someone still fighting addiction. Hello, James. John. James gestured toward his office. Let's talk privately. Once the door closed, John seemed to struggle with where to begin. I wanted to thank you, he said finally. For what? For buying Dad's company instead of letting it die completely. For keeping some of the staff employed. For, John paused, gathering his courage. For not destroying me personally when you had every reason to. James leaned back in his chair, studying Ernest's son with clinical interest. You destroyed yourself, John. I didn't need to help. I know, but you could have made it worse. Blacklisted me from the industry entirely. Made sure I never worked in finance again. Is that what you want? To work in finance again? John's laugh was bitter. God, no. I was never cut out for this world. I only tried because Dad expected it. Because I thought it was my birthright. So what are you doing now? Teaching. High school mathematics in Brooklyn. The pay is terrible, the hours are long, and most of my students think I'm an idiot. John's smile was genuine for the first time James could remember. I love it. You're teaching high school. Turns out I'm pretty good at explaining complex concepts to people who don't want to learn them, which, considering my experience with institutional investors, makes perfect sense. Despite himself, James felt a flicker of respect for the man sitting across from him. How's your father handling your career change? Dad doesn't speak to me anymore. Says I'm wasting my education, embarrassing the family name. John shrugged. But there's no family name anymore, is there? You made sure of that. Your father made sure of that when he prioritized family politics over fiduciary responsibility. I know. And James, I need you to know that I understand why you did what you did. Dad treated you terribly. He dismissed your talent, disrespected your contributions, and tried to throw you away like garbage. You had every right to defend yourself. James remained silent, waiting to see where this conversation was leading. But I also need you to understand something else, John continued. My father isn't evil. He's just broken. He built his identity around being the patriarch of a financial dynasty. And when you proved that bloodline meant less than talent, it shattered everything he believed about himself. And you think that excuses his behavior? No, but it explains it. Dad spent his whole life believing that family loyalty was the highest virtue, that taking care of your own people mattered more than anything else. When he fired you and hired me, he thought he was protecting his family's future. He was protecting his ego. Maybe. Probably. But James, I've spent the last year thinking about what happened, and I've realized something. You and Dad are more alike than either of you wants to admit. James's expression hardened. Explain. You both believe that loyalty is the highest virtue. You both put family above everything else. You both view the world in terms of us versus them. John leaned forward, his voice earnest. The only difference is that you're better at protecting the people you love. That's not, isn't it? Everything you did over the past year was designed to protect your reputation, your career, your future with Angelica. You identified Dad as a threat to your family's security, and you eliminated that threat completely. James felt uncomfortable with the comparison, but he couldn't entirely dismiss it. The difference, he said carefully, is that I never betrayed anyone's trust. I never prioritized personal relationships over professional responsibility. No, you just made sure that anyone who crossed you paid a price they'd never forget. The accusation hung in the air between them. James realized that John Ross, the failed heir, the recovering addict, the high school math teacher, had identified something about him that he'd never fully acknowledged. What do you want from me, John? Nothing. I just wanted you to know that I understand what happened, why it happened, and that I don't blame you for it. But I also wanted to ask you something, which is, what kind of man do you want to be going forward? The kind who builds something great, or the kind who destroys anyone who threatens him? Before James could respond, John stood and moved toward the door. For what it's worth, he said, pausing at the threshold, I think you're a good man who did what he had to do. But good men can become dangerous when they convince themselves that destruction is the same thing as justice. After John left, James sat alone in his office, staring out at the Manhattan skyline, where other ambitious men were building their own empires and plotting their own revenge. The conversation had unsettled him in ways he couldn't fully articulate. His phone buzzed with a text from Angelica. Dinner tonight? I have news. Good news or bad news? He replied. Life-changing news. James smiled despite his philosophical discomfort. Whatever John Ross thought about his character, whatever questions he might have about his own motivations, one thing remained constant: his love for Angelica and their shared future. He spent the rest of the afternoon reviewing investment strategies and client portfolios, but his mind kept returning to John's question. That evening, Angelica was waiting in their apartment with champagne and an expression he'd never seen before. Nervous excitement mixed with pure joy. What's the news? He asked, pulling her into his arms. We're going to have a baby. The words hit him like lightning, instantly recontextualizing everything in his life. His empire, his success, his victory over Ernest Ross. Suddenly none of it mattered compared to the miracle of new life. Are you sure? I'm sure. 12 weeks. James picked her up and spun her around their living room, both of them laughing with the giddy happiness of people whose lives had just changed forever. As they celebrated with champagne, sparkling cider for Angelica, James felt the weight of responsibility settling over him like a warm blanket. He was going to be a father. He was going to be responsible for shaping another human being's understanding of the world. James, Angelica said as they sat together on their couch, I want our child to know their grandfather. The statement stopped him cold. Ernest, he's the only grandfather our baby will have. Your parents are gone, and despite everything that's happened, he's still my father. James felt the familiar surge of anger at the mention of Ernest Ross, but underneath, it was something new, the realization that holding grudges might cost his child a relationship with family. Angelica, after everything he did was to me and to you. It has nothing to do with our baby. She took his hand, her grip gentle but firm. James, I'm not asking you to forgive him or trust him or do business with him. I'm asking you to consider that revenge becomes meaningless when it starts affecting innocent people. He's not innocent. Our child is. James stared into his wife's eyes, seeing not just love, but wisdom. She was asking him to make a choice between the satisfaction of continued punishment and the possibility of healing. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that maybe it's time to let go. You won, completely and permanently. Ernest knows it. I know it. The entire financial world knows it. You've proven everything you needed to prove. And if I let him back into our lives, what happens when he tries to manipulate our child the way he manipulated everyone else? Then we set boundaries. We protect our family without destroying his. Angelica placed his hand on her still flat stomach. This baby is going to grow up in a world where their father is one of the most successful investment managers in history. I want them to understand that success came from talent and hard work, not from the ability to destroy enemies. James thought about John Ross's question about the kind of man he wanted to be. For the first time in over a year, he considered the possibility that complete victory might require mercy rather than continued punishment. "I'll think about it," he said finally. "That's all I ask." As they sat together planning their future, James realized that the most important decision of his life wasn't about business strategy or competitive advantage. It was about the kind of father he wanted to be, the kind of legacy he wanted to leave, and the kind of world he wanted to create for his child. Ernest Ross had taught him that loyalty without power was meaningless. But perhaps it was time to learn a different lesson. That power without mercy was just another form of weakness. The war was over. Now came the much harder task of building a lasting peace. And there you have it. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen. And I'll see you there.